There are places in this world where darkness never truly leaves, where the walls themselves seem to hold memories of suffering and despair. Blackwood Asylum stands as one of these cursed structures, a massive Gothic building perched on a hill, its broken windows staring down like hollow eyes at the town below. Built in 1897 as a facility for the mentally ill, it devolved over decades into a house of horrors where experimental treatments and neglect claimed countless lives. The asylum closed in 1987 amid scandal, its records sealed and its history buried. Tonight, paranormal investigator Marcus Chen and his team will spend the night inside, documenting what remains. They seek answers, evidence, and perhaps closure for the souls who never left. What they'll find instead is a truth far more terrifying than any ghost story. Block 1. Entering the asylum. Marcus Chen stood before the asylum's entrance as twilight painted the sky in shades of blood and shadow. His team gathered around him, Sarah with her camera, Derek with audio equipment, and Maya, the historian who knew every dark secret this place held. The massive double doors hung partially open, revealing an entrance hall consumed by darkness. Marcus felt the weight of the place immediately, a pressure in the air that made breathing slightly harder, as if the building itself resented their intrusion. The entrance hall was a cathedral of decay. The ceilings soared 3 stories above them. Portions collapsed to reveal rusted support beams and exposed wiring that hung like dead vines. The floor was covered in debris, broken tiles, chunks of plaster, shattered glass that crunched under their boots. Graffiti covered the lower walls, tags from teenagers who dared each other to enter over the years, but Marcus noticed that none of the graffiti extended very far into the building, as if even vandals had felt something that made them turn back. Sarah began filming, her camera light cutting through the gloom as they moved deeper inside. The main corridor stretched ahead impossibly long, lined with doors on both sides, patient rooms, treatment areas, administrative offices, all standing open like mouths frozen in silent screams. Derek's equipment began picking up sounds immediately. Creaks and groans from the settling structure, the whistle of wind through broken windows, and underneath it all, something else. A low-frequency hum that shouldn't exist in an abandoned building with no power. Maya led them to the west wing first, where the general patient population had been housed. The rooms here were small, barely large enough for a bed and a chair, with heavy doors designed to lock from the outside. Restraint hooks still protruded from some walls, and in several rooms, scratch marks covered every surface, desperate marks left by people trying to claw their way to freedom or sanity. The sight made even Marcus, with all his years of investigations, feel a deep unease settling into his bones. As they documented the West Wing, strange things began happening. Sarah's camera would focus on empty doorways, only to show fleeting shadows in the playback. Derek's audio equipment captured whispers in languages he didn't recognize, and once, clearly, a woman's voice saying, "Help us," in perfect modern English. The temperature fluctuated wildly. One room would be freezing cold, while the adjacent one felt warm, almost feverish. Marcus tried to maintain his scientific approach, cataloging each anomaly, searching for rational explanations. Old buildings make noise. Temperature differences can be explained by airflow. Shadows are just tricks of light. But even as he told himself these things, doubt crept in. They reached the day room where patients had once gathered for supervised activities. It was a large space with windows along one wall, most of them broken now, allowing moonlight to stream in and create pools of silver among the shadows. Old furniture remained, chairs arranged in a circle as if waiting for a therapy session that would never come. A piano in the corner with most of its keys missing, board games scattered across tables with their pieces long since lost. And on the walls, more artwork, paintings and drawings created by patients, some beautiful and heartbreaking, others disturbing in ways that suggested minds touched by something beyond simple illness. Block 2. the deeper darkness. As midnight approached, Maya led them to the East Wing, the section where the most severe cases had been kept, where the treatments had been most experimental and least ethical. The atmosphere changed immediately upon entering this area. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe, and a smell pervaded everything, not just decay and mildew, but something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. The walls here were padded in places, the material rotted and hanging in strips that looked disturbingly like flayed skin. They found the hydrotherapy rooms first, where patients had been subjected to extreme hot and cold water treatments that often lasted hours. The massive tubs still remained stained and cracked, their drains clogged with decades of debris. Derek's equipment went haywire in this room, his meters spiking to maximum levels for no reason he could explain. Sarah captured footage of the tubs, and when they reviewed it later, they would see shadows moving beneath the surface of empty basins, as if something was swimming in water that wasn't there. The isolation cells were worse. Tiny rooms barely larger than closets, completely dark when the doors were closed, where patients deemed dangerous or disruptive had been kept for days or weeks at a time. Marcus forced himself to enter one, and the moment the door swung partially shut behind him, claustrophobia hit like a physical force. He could hear breathing that wasn't his own, feel fingers brushing against him in the darkness, though no one was there. He stumbled out after only 30 seconds, his heart racing, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold. They discovered the surgical theater on the 3rd floor, a room that made everyone stop in their tracks. This was where lobotomies had been performed, where doctors had destroyed parts of patients' brains in the name of treatment. The operating table still stood in the center of the room, its leather restraints cracked but intact. Surgical instruments were scattered across a nearby tray, their metal surfaces dark with rust that might have been something else once. On the walls, someone had painted names, hundreds of them, covering every available surface. Maya recognized some from her research, patients who died during procedures, who'd been buried in unmarked graves in the field behind the asylum. As Sarah filmed the surgical theater, her camera captured something that made everyone's blood run cold. On the playback, reflected in the metal tray of instruments, a face appeared, not any of the team members but someone else. A man in an old-fashioned surgical gown and mask, standing exactly where a surgeon would stand during an operation. The figure was there for only 3 frames of video, less than 1/10 of a second, but it was undeniable. Marcus tried to explain it away, a trick of light, a reflection of something else, but his voice lacked conviction. They found the children's ward last, and it broke something in all of them. Small beds lined the walls, some still covered with rotted blankets. Toys lay scattered on the floor, dolls with missing eyes, wooden blocks, a rocking horse that swayed slightly despite the still air. The walls were covered in children's drawings, faded but still visible. Families, houses, sunshine, normal things that these institutionalized children had been desperate to remember or imagine. Maya's voice broke as she explained that children as young as 5 had been kept here, diagnosed with everything from moral insanity to simple behavioral problems, separated from their families and subjected to the same brutal treatments as adult patients. Block 3, the truth revealed. At 3 a.m., the hour paranormal investigators call the witching hour, everything changed. The team had gathered in the central administrative area, reviewing their footage and audio recordings, when every piece of electronic equipment they had suddenly died. Cameras, audio recorders, flashlights, even their phones, all went dark simultaneously, leaving them in absolute blackness. For several seconds, no one moved or spoke, paralyzed by sudden blindness and the primal fear it invokes. Then the lights came on, not their equipment, but the asylum's lights, impossible lights, in a building that had no power. Fluorescent fixtures that should have been dead for decades flickered to life throughout the building, casting everything in sickly green illumination. The building came alive around them. Doors began slamming in sequence, creating a rhythm that moved through the corridors like a wave. They heard footsteps, dozens of them running, walking, shuffling, coming from every direction. Voices filled the air, crying, laughing, screaming, pleading. The sounds weren't threatening exactly, but they were overwhelming, a cacophony of suffering given voice. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm, shouting to be heard over the noise, telling everyone to stay together and move toward the exit. But when they tried to retrace their steps, the building had changed. Corridors that had led one direction now turned another. Doors they'd come through were locked or opened onto walls. The asylum was not letting them leave. Maya seemed to understand something the others didn't. She stopped fighting the building's pull and instead moved deeper toward the basement, a section they'd planned to avoid because it was considered too structurally unsound. "We have to go down," she shouted over the noise. "The records room is in the basement." The real records, the ones they tried to destroy before the closure. That's what it wants us to see. That's why we're here. Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to insist they find another way out, but something in Maya's eyes, a certainty born of years studying this place, made him trust her. The basement stairs descended into darkness that the impossible lights above didn't penetrate. They used the last working flashlight Derek had somehow managed to keep functional, its beam weak and flickering. The basement was flooded with several inches of stagnant water that splashed around their ankles as they walked. Pipes dripped overhead, creating a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. The walls were lined with morgue drawers, most hanging open and empty, but some still contained remains. Not just bones, but shapes wrapped in rotted fabric that none of them wanted to examine too closely. They found the records room behind a door marked Archives, Authorized Personnel Only. Inside, filing cabinets lined every wall, and a desk sat in the center covered in documents. Despite the decay everywhere else, this room was somehow preserved, dry, intact, as if waiting. Maya went straight to a specific cabinet, pulled open a drawer, and extracted a file. Her hands shook as she opened it and began reading by flashlight. Her face went pale, then hardened with anger. "These are the real treatment records," she said quietly, "not the sanitized versions in the public archives. These document everything. The experiments, the deaths, the cover-ups. Patients were used as test subjects for drugs that weren't approved. People who were committed for minor issues were kept for years, decades, because the asylum received funding for each patient. Families were told their loved ones had died, when really they'd just been moved to worse sections. And the final entries. There's evidence that some staff members knew the building was dangerous, that portions were collapsing, but they kept patients locked in those sections anyway. The fire that led to the closure wasn't an accident. It was deliberately set by a staff member who couldn't live with what was happening here anymore. As Maya spoke, the chaos around them subsided, the voices quieted, the footsteps stopped. The lights, those impossible lights, began to dim. The building had shown them what it needed them to know. Marcus took the files Maya handed him, dozens of them documenting horrors that should never be forgotten. This was why they'd been allowed in. This was why the building had trapped them, not to harm them, but to ensure the truth finally came out. The souls trapped here didn't want revenge. They wanted to be remembered, to have their suffering acknowledged and their stories told. The team made their way back upstairs, and this time the building didn't resist. The corridors led them directly to the entrance. Their equipment began working again as they crossed the threshold into the pre-dawn darkness outside. Behind them, they heard one final sound. Not screams or cries, but something like a collective sigh, as if the building itself was finally able to rest. They sat in their van for a long time, no one speaking, processing what they'd experienced. Marcus held the files carefully, knowing they contained evidence that would change everything. Not proof of ghosts or hauntings, but proof of human cruelty and the suffering it caused, which was more terrifying than any supernatural phenomenon. Conclusion. The footage from that night became the most watched episode of Rational Hauntings ever uploaded. But it wasn't the paranormal activity that captivated viewers, it was the files. Marcus worked with journalists and investigators to verify the documents they'd found, and the subsequent reports forced officials to unseal Blackwood's full records. Families of patients who'd been told their loved ones had died decades ago learned the truth. The developer cancelled his plans to build condos, and the property was instead designated as a memorial site. The building was eventually demolished for safety, but a monument was erected, listing the names of every person who'd died there, ensuring they would never be forgotten. Marcus's perspective on the paranormal shifted after that night. He still didn't believe in traditional hauntings, but he came to understand that places could hold memories, that trauma could imprint itself on environments in ways science hadn't yet fully explained. Blackwood Asylum taught him that the real horror isn't ghosts, it's what humans do to each other, and how easily we forget the suffering we cause. The investigation changed all of them. Sarah became an advocate for mental health reform. Derek started using his audio skills to document oral histories from mental health facilities. Maya finally published her comprehensive history of the asylum, a book that became required reading in psychology and medical ethics courses. On quiet nights, Marcus sometimes thinks about that moment in the basement when the building grew still, when the tormented voices finally found peace. He wonders if consciousness truly can persist beyond death, if suffering can echo through time until someone finally listens. He doesn't have answers, only questions and memories of a night when an abandoned building refused to let its stories die. The asylum may be gone, reduced to rubble and dust, but the truth it held survives, a reminder that some investigations uncover horrors that are all too human, and that bearing witness to the forgotten is sometimes the most important work anyone can do.